Hello and welcome to Diversifying the Outdoors and National Lands. My name is Chandler Randall and I am the Manager of Educational Programs here at the Environmental Law Institute, and I am so delighted to welcome everyone to this webinar. ELI is proud to offer programming on cutting-edge issues in environmental law and policy, and it is such an honor to have you join us for this special program today. At the end of today's webinar, we will have time for a Q&A session, so please submit your questions through GoTo's question box, and please do not wait until the end. Send in your questions as soon as you think of them. I would like to thank our outstanding panelists for joining us today to lend their expertise to this webinar, and while they will be introduced briefly, the full speaker bios are posted on our website, eli.org, and I encourage you to check out their expertise and experience in more detail there. As we begin, I would like to briefly introduce today's moderator, Ryland Lee. Ryland is an attorney advisor for the Office of General Counsel, Air and Radiation Law Office at the Environmental Protection Agency. Ryland received his JD from Harvard Law School and dual bachelor's degrees in economics and government from Dartmouth College. Thank you all so much, and with that, I will turn things over to our amazing moderator, Ryland Lee. Thank you all so much.
Well, thank you, Chandler, and thank you to the Environmental Law Institute for the honor of being able to moderate today's panel. Thanks also to Lisa and Laura for speaking on this panel. You guys are the real experts here today, so I look forward to learning a lot from both of you. As Chandler mentioned, I'm an attorney in EPA's Office of General Counsel. I mostly work on air pollution control and administrative law. I also do lead a team in our office for improving diversity, equity, and inclusion in our attorney hiring efforts, and look forward to sharing a little bit about that with you. So why are we here today? We're here, of course, to talk about diversifying outdoors and public lands. I'll start by just throwing out a statistic that people of color make up roughly 40% of the US population, but approximately 70% of people who visit national forests, wildlife refuges, and parks are white. And among the people of color, African Americans tend to be the most underrepresented group in these spaces. So there are these disparities in access. And at the same time, I think we all probably share this notion that going to the outdoors, and particularly going to public lands by virtue of being public, are something that's meant for everybody and should be accessible to everyone. So why does this disparity exist? Is it really a problem? Why is it a problem? And what are we doing about it? This is what we'll be talking about today. I also think that there is some increased urgency for this topic at this time, in part because of the killings of George Floyd and others last summer, the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement over the last several years, and the increased understanding of systemic racial injustice. And we'll see that access to the outdoors and public lands is also part of that fabric. Another reason for the relevance of this topic today, I think, is the profound challenges of climate change that we face and the mobilization of many, many aspects of society to confront that. And underlying that is, I think, a connection between environmental protection, policy, and just people caring about the environment with people's personal experience of the outdoors. One big driver for why people care for the environment and care for the climate is that we have meaningful personal experiences in the outdoors that create a sense of connection with these important spaces. So with that, to kick us off a little bit, the rest of our time together will begin with opening remarks from each of our speakers. Lisa, I think you'll go first. I'll read your bio. You'll have a few minutes to introduce yourself, talk about your organization and why you're here, and then we'll go to Laura. After that, there's some questions that we'll go through, and finally, we will end with the audience Q&A. We'll try to leave at least 20 minutes for that. And as Chandler mentioned, please submit your questions throughout the talk. Do not wait until the very end. All right, so we'll start with Lisa. Lisa Agenberg is the Executive Director of the Outdoor Industry Association, OIA. Prior to joining OIA, she served as the Executive Director of the Outdoor Foundation, the philanthropic arm of OIA. She has also served as the Executive Vice President for the National Park Foundation and the Executive Director of the Great Outdoors Colorado Trust Fund. Over to you, Lisa.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here this morning. I do need to qualify. I would not say I'm an expert on this issue. It's an issue that I've probably spent the last 10 years thinking about and talking to people about, and really working with the outdoor industry now on how they can be part of the solution. So I represent the Outdoor Industry Association, which is a trade association. And we started 30 years ago really to work on tax issues, but the industry pretty quickly pivoted to really focusing on policy and research around who goes outside, how do they connect with the outdoors, and around conservation and outdoor recreation issues. More than any other industry in the United States, we are dependent upon people going outside, places being protected to go outside. And so we're really focused right now around thriving business, all people thriving outside, and a thriving planet. So climate is the other issue that is top of mind for us. And we have about 1,200 companies. They range anywhere from very large retailers that you'd be familiar with, like REI and L.L. Bean, to manufacturers like the North Face and Patagonia, and smaller companies like BioLite and Nemo, and then suppliers, which are things like Gore-Tex. And we're not a regulatory body, but we do a lot of convening, and the work that we do is typically arranged around research, convening, policy, and action. And the two places we're really focused on action right now are our Climate Action Corps, which is over 100 of our largest companies have come together to reduce their own greenhouse gases, measure them, and engage in climate policy. And then on the Thriving People side, it's really the work of our foundation, but we're expanding that. And our Outdoor Foundation is very much focused right now on how do we increase the number of children of color that have access to the outdoors. I'll stop there and turn it back to you so that you can introduce Laura.
Awesome. Thank you, Lisa. And we look forward to learning more from you throughout our talk today. So our next speaker is Laura Edmondson. Laura is the Corporate Responsibility Manager at Brown Girls Climb. She is a multiracial, multidiscipline rock climber. Laura grew up in Tennessee, where she fell in love with the outdoors by camping and hiking in the Smoky Mountains. After college, she moved to Jackson, Wyoming, where she was first introduced to climbing. And after taking a year-long climbing trip around the world, Laura settled in the Northeast and now manages a nonprofit called At Best Buddies that strives for the social inclusion of people in intellectual and developmental disabilities. When she's not working, Laura enjoys exploring her new home in New Hampshire and climbing at Rumney Rocks. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you. So hi everyone, my name is Laura Edmondson, and as Rylan said, I'm the Corporate Responsibility Manager for Brown Girls Climb. Brown Girls Climb is a small mission-driven company. It's all women of color owned and operated, and we focus on increasing diversity and access to the outdoors, specifically through rock climbing for women, femmes, and non-binary people of color. A lot of what that looks like publicly is hosting meetups, getting women of color into rock climbing gyms or into groups where they can go and climb outside together. We have scholarship funds for trainings and for certifications for women of color, because getting people into positions at guiding companies and with other outdoor organizations is really important to what we do and to changing the culture in the outdoors. Behind the scenes, we do a lot more with sustainability and with justice, equity, inclusion work, getting outdoor brands kind of caught up, working in more progressive directions, and things like that. We also host the Color the Crag Climbing Festival every year, which is, I believe, the first of its kind. It's all for climbers of color and any allies who want to attend. And we've hosted that 3 years in a row now. Personally, I also work as a digital educator on Instagram, and I host and created the podcast Let Us Rest.
Awesome, thanks, Laura. You're a person of many talents. All right, so we'll move on to our first question. And Lisa, I think we'll start with you, so just to prepare you. And our first question is just talking about, what are the different ways in which access to the outdoors may not be as diverse and inclusive as we might want it to be? And I think we've already, both of you and I have already touched a little bit on this. I think it includes a range of things from just who is visiting the public lands, who is participating in particular outdoors activities, but it also includes who is being represented in these outdoors related professions, particularly in C-suites and other top positions, as well as who do people see when they look at advertising or marketing from outdoor companies, and perhaps other things that you'd like to add as well. So Lisa?
Sure, thank you. And I loved the way you framed that, because when we think about people in the outdoors, it really needs to be a systems approach. And it can't just be we're going to hire people or we're going to get people outdoors or we're going to focus on policy. It really needs to be in all of the above. We, from a research standpoint at the foundation, which I used to run, have tracked participation in the outdoors. And the way we think about the outdoors is it's not just the federal lands and further away nature, but it also includes close to home recreation. And some of the key findings there are that we have for years skewed more white, more male, and more wealthy than the rest of the population in terms of who goes outside. The good news is that that is changing. And in 2019, and we don't have the results yet for 2020, but we'll shortly, but in 2019, we saw significant increases in Black and Hispanic populations going outside. And interestingly enough, the Asian American population gets outside more than Caucasian. So yes, a little known fact I like to share. But it is changing, and I think it's changing because of groups like Brown Girls Climb and some of these other groups really working to get people outside. But as I mentioned, it really is going to take a systems level approach. And so when I think about that, the other thing in the research that we found is that children who were taken outdoors as children, when they become adults, are much more likely to keep going outside. So that's why at the foundation, we're very focused on getting children outside, but we also recognize there are already a lot of Black and Brown people getting outside through groups like Brown Girls Climb or on their own. And companies really need to recognize that. And then, what are the pipelines and pathways once kids have gone through these programs that engage them with the outdoors? What are the pipelines into the outdoor industry or into the federal resource management agencies? How do we help with that? And then marketing is key, because even if you've enjoyed the outdoors, if you don't see yourself in the outdoors and see people like you in the outdoors, in the marketing and materials that get shared by outdoor companies and agencies representing the outdoors, then that's a lost opportunity and a lost it's a key finding that we find with a barrier to the outdoors. And then what do the companies look like, and how do they represent the people they're trying to serve? And whether that's you're a federal agency or an outdoor company. I will say from the outdoor company part, it's something our companies are very focused on. We're about to put a survey out to look at what the composition is throughout all levels. And to do a workforce survey to try to figure out what are the jobs that we have, what are the skills that are needed, and also how well are we represented in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion within our companies. So we're very much looking at it like that system. And then the last piece to the system is policy. It really is going to take both local policy, state policy, and federal federal policy to change this. An example at the federal level will be Outdoors for All. There's also an opportunity with 30 by 30 for nature, and including equitable access to the outdoors and tribes. At the state level, similar kinds of policies are around where do you locate the spaces for people to get outdoors. We know there is data from the Trust for Public Land that indicates that 28 million children and 100 million Americans do not live within a 10-minute walk of a park. And during COVID-19 in particular, having somewhere within 10 minutes of your house has become a crucial barometer for whether or not you have access to the outdoors.
Thanks, Lisa. I did not know that there had been a change kind of in the trends of access by people of color in 2019, and that's really great to hear, and I hope that continues. I'll turn it over to Laura for answer to this question.
Yeah, I was actually on a similar panel yesterday and talked about this. I kind of look at it from a two-sided approach. So you've got access to the outdoors, and then you've got the culture that's going to be greeting you there once you get access. So from one perspective, there's a ton of barriers. Not only is there the cost for gear, if you think about who is the most likely to have free time to spend outside, communities of color are historically denied access at a younger age. I know that's something that we were talking about earlier, that early childhood experiences in the outdoors leads to more adult experiences as well. So just not getting outdoors at a young age leads to just, a lack of interest when you get older. Yeah, there's cultural narratives that we are told and that we perpetuate ourselves, saying that like, that's not for us, that's not what our people do, that's white people stuff, that's something I've heard before. So there are a lot of reasons that access isn't there. Then for those of us who have made it over those barriers and have found our way into the outdoors, it's not always the most welcoming or safe feeling culture once you get there. There are expectations for, just etiquette, even just being on the trail, there are expectations of how you're going to act that are not necessarily aligned with, Black culture. The way the Black community interacts when we're together may not be what's expected on the trail. And so that makes it feel not welcoming. There's expectations of the level of expertise that you're going to have to show up and know exactly what you're doing. And if you don't, then there's a lot of judgment that you can face. So things like that. And I know, Lisa, you touched on a lot of the things that I would have said as well when it comes to representation and who is making the decisions on the representation that we do see. So I'll just throw in a second to what you said.
Thanks, Laura. And I really appreciate how both of you really think about this in such a holistic way and all the different aspects of this problem. And I like the word that Lisa used, systems thinking. Right? So I want to ask both of you a few more questions to kind of unpack what we just talked about. Laura, I think you in particular talked a lot about culture and cultural perceptions about who belongs in the outdoors, or culturally set expectations about what it's like for me to be in the outdoors or for somebody to be in the outdoors. Could you share with us any more thoughts on why is it that these different groups of people have different cultural expectations or perceptions about who belongs and how they should belong?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, it's a lot of it is done on purpose, because the Black community, I'll speak for our community, does have such a rich history in the outdoors, from working the land to living on the land. The Buffalo Soldiers were a group of Black people who lived on public land. So we do have this history, but once the infrastructure was there and people started getting outdoors more, it just, as a product of segregation, became a more white. It was, we were pushed out, we weren't allowed in, we weren't welcomed in. So not only that, but just like historically, again, not having the time to get outdoors from you know, not having the agency during the enslavement period to, again, segregation and Jim Crow. There are all these reasons that play into this systemic lack of access to the outdoors. And so once you haven't had access, it becomes part of the culture that we don't even seek it, or we tell ourselves we don't want it. So I mean, it's a very long history, but it was definitely done on purpose. It's not something that just came about spontaneously, or something that's rooted in fact.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and the reason I use systems is because of that. It's systemic racism that has created the issue, and it's going to take a system. You know, just as Laura talked about, to really think about how we rethink this, how we talk about it, how we act, who we honor, who we turn the power over to, and it's complex. And from the outdoor industry standpoint, we're just figuring this out. You know, I have to show some humility here. We do not have all the answers. And it's really going, you know, it's listening to these voices and figuring out how do we step aside. And I think this is true, having worked for the federal government and for state government, is instead of just thinking that printing a brochure in Hispanic or changing a park entrance sign that makes it welcoming. That's not a cultural change. That's a Band-Aid. I don't know what another word to call that. And so really thinking about how do you rely on the organizations and really bring them in, like Brown Girls Climb, that are doing the work. We don't need to create new programs within every state, federal, and local agency. There are a lot of organizations that are Black run or Brown led or women led that are doing this work, and how do we make sure they're driving the work?
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks, Laura. I think, yeah, the points you guys made are really important. And, you know, sometimes I have conversations with folks about the outdoors and access to public land, and folks will say, well, you know, like, there's a park, it's there, like everybody can just go visit it, and so then why aren't they doing that? And maybe it's their fault that they're not doing that, right? And I think your responses highlight that, yeah, like, you know, we can look at things as they are now, but we have to understand them in the context of history. And there's so many historical forces that really shape how people experience the world today. And that history, you know, remains very much real and alive, right? Like, we might not have, you know, legally enforced segregation of public spaces like we did before the Civil Rights Act, but the legacy of that in how people perceive things and in cultural expectations really remains. And I think that's a very important point that shouldn't be lost. So the next question, I'll start by asking Lisa. So Lisa, earlier you talked a lot about employment in outdoors related professions and trying to increase diversity and inclusion in these professions. Could you share any more thoughts about that? Why is it that historically, you know, minorities have been disproportionately underrepresented in these professions, and yeah, what's being done about that?
Yeah, and I don't know that I have the answer to this, but I think back to the fact that I started in the natural resources world almost 30 years ago, and at that time, women weren't even a predominant force within the outdoor industry, certainly not within natural resource management. And it's different from you know, the issues surrounding racial inequity, but you know, I think what we have to remember is where we started 20 years ago was not great either. And, you know, I think there have been some big strides made, but I do think it's just within the last few years that it's really being heard. and something significant is being done. And it certainly has accelerated as a result of the traumas that were experienced this summer. I don't think we have a perfect solution yet. I think many of the companies, I can't speak for the federal management agencies, but I know for outdoor companies, many of them are trying very hard. Some are struggling. The other organization that is supported by the outdoor industry is something called Camber Outdoors, which was started, again, 20 years ago to really increase the number of women working in the outdoor industry and in the C-suite. And probably, I want to say about 4 years ago, they really shifted their focus to increasing diversity in the workplace, and have created a program for outdoor companies to have basically a consultancy that helps them attract, not just attract diversity, but really make sure inclusion is happening. What does inclusion mean? Because it's not enough just to hire that first or second person. If they don't feel welcome and included, they're not going to stay. And so, this is very much what Camber is focused on. Many of our companies are focused on this. We have some companies who are doing a fantastic job, like the VF Corporation, which includes the North Face, Timberland, Vans, now Supreme, which is a streetwear brand, and have really focused on this. I think every brand is tackling it in the way that they can, and Camber is the accelerator.
Thanks, Lisa. And Laura, would you like to share any thoughts on that topic?
Sure. So it's something that we're trying to support at Brown Girls Climb as well, is getting more people of color, specifically women, into positions of leadership in the outdoor industry. I think some of the barriers that are coming to mind for me are just the certifications, the education that's required can sometimes be a barrier. So working with organizations to find ways around those, like supporting people if they need a higher degree. So do you have to hire someone with a master's degree already, or could you offer support for that person to get that degree as part of their role at the company? Offering scholarships for certain certifications and courses to help people get the qualifications that they would need. And like Camber is doing, just connecting people with job opportunities, because a lot of people who are new to the industry but want to get involved may not even know where to look. So those are just a few of the things I'm doing.
I should add, there's another group that we're working with that I think Brown Girls Climb is familiar with, that has worked with federal agencies, and that's the Greening Youth Foundation. It's based out of Atlanta, and they have done a great job at connecting people to those entry-level internship experiences in the federal government. But now what they're really looking at is how can they take the people that have had the internship experiences and connect them to long-term full-time jobs, either in the federal agencies or within outdoor companies. So there are a lot of different, sometimes grassroots, sometimes national groups really working to help make this connection, because I think what the outdoor companies are starting to realize is they know what they don't know, and we should be looking to groups like Brown Girls Climb and the Greening Youth Foundation to help us.
Thanks, Lisa. Since we're talking about hiring and retaining folks, I'll also share a little bit of my own experience. As I mentioned at the beginning, I lead a team of folks in my office, EPA's Office of General Counsel, working on improving diversity, equity, and inclusion in our hiring. And we are attempting to do, or have been doing, a number of different things. One important initiative is trying to pay our interns. We used to pay our interns maybe about 10 years ago, and then we stopped, in part due to budgetary reasons, in part due to new regulatory barriers that were erected. And we are working on kind of finding how to pay our clerks, despite all those barriers. And I think this is something, that's just so important, right? Because if you have an unpaid internship, folks who don't have that wealth, who need to work to make money over the summer, are not going to be able to do that. And then that has pretty obvious effects down the road where they don't have that experience, so they're less qualified perhaps to work for that organization or that sector in the future. And they also just know fewer people who are in that organization and sector. Another thing that we're trying to do is to think very hard about our criteria for hiring. I think historically there has been interest in hiring people who have previous government experience, since we're a government agency and we value public service, and also in hiring people with environmental experience, particularly for jobs that specifically focus on environmental protection. And I think those are legitimate criteria, of course, right? But at the same time, they also pose a real risk of winnowing people out who may very well be very interested and a good fit for the organization, but simply haven't been able to have those experiences, right? Those government internships, because a lot of those are unpaid, or the environmental internships because perhaps they found something that was better paying over the summer, or perhaps for some of the kind of cultural expectation reasons that Laura was mentioning earlier. And I think we've seen that folks from other backgrounds as well can equally have an interest and a commitment to public service and protecting the environment, and can also bring their own perspectives in whatever kind of industry or sector they were in before to our workplace. And the final thing that we're doing, which I think many folks are also doing, is just making it really clear in our job announcements that we care about diversity, why we care about diversity, and why it's important. So our most recent job announcement said we value diversity, and the reason we value it is because we think diversity will improve the substantive outcomes of our legal advice. So by having multiple perspectives in the room, we can generate more creative ideas and come up with more holistic solutions. And also because as a government agency, we think that our workforce should reflect the demographics of the people we serve, which is all of you and the entire all Americans. Another kind of related thing we've done to our job postings is under the qualification section, we list diversity as a qualification. We say that people who have a strong ability to work with others from different backgrounds and perspectives is something that we are explicitly looking for. And in fact, that's always been an important skill, because there are lots of different people who work in the federal government, and there's obviously a lot of diversity in the stakeholders that we interact with. And so, yeah, we've kind of recognized that more explicitly now in our more recent job postings. So that's some of what we're trying to do at my organization to improve diversity in the profession. Okay.
I'm glad you brought up the pay issue, and I hope Laura can address this as well. But when you think about this system, and I think back on my career, I had an internship on Capitol Hill, paid nothing. That's a barrier. Not many people can do that. I cocktail waitressed at night. I don't wish that on anybody. And then I had an internship at EPA, which was paid. So I'm sad to hear that wasn't paid. And I think about now, everyone is promoting Climate Corps and Conservation Corps, which is great, but some of those core jobs are capped at $15,000 a year, and that's a barrier for many people. So I don't know, Laura, and then for our industry, the pay issue has come up with influencers and athletes, and that our industry has really had an issue with not having to pay influencers and athletes, and really is having to do that now, because again, that was a barrier.
Yeah, I can definitely speak to this. So like you were saying, not only paying people, but paying people well, because not only do we need to be paid for our work, but Black women specifically carry more student debt than I believe any other marginalized group. So making sure that we not only pay our current bills, but to offset the cost of qualifying for the job that we are taking at your company is also something to consider. And yeah, speaking as someone who has partnered with brands on Instagram and other social media platforms, there is this culture of expecting people to work for free, which is just not equitable, and doesn't make much sense. Oh shoot, there was something else I wanted to add. If it comes to me, I might jump back in with it.
Okay, no worries. Feel free to jump back in at any time.
Okay, just completely.
Okay. So we're going to talk more about kind of more concrete issues and solutions later on. But our next question is a little bit of a more kind of conceptual 30,000-foot question, which is, why does all of this matter? Like, why does it matter that there's a lack of diversity and inclusion on some of these areas? And I'm not asking it to be glib, but I'm asking it to really have us unpack, what are all the reasons in which it matters? Lisa, you want to start with this one?
Sure, I talk about this all the time. At its most basic level, we should care because we're humans, and it should just be the right of everybody to have access to clean air, clean water, protected lands, places to go, jobs. That should just be a human right. But at an economic level and a long-term conservation durability level, we also need to be concerned. And the future of America is not white. And so we need to be thinking about future customers, future voters. Again, I put it first as a human right, but this economic argument is real. From a workplace standpoint, there's a lot of data, and it's from the McKinsey around how more diverse workplaces make better decisions. And then if you're from a conservation organization or you're working in a federal agency on natural resource management issues, if people don't know about an issue, experience the outdoors and fall in love with it, they're not going to fight to protect it. And I think as we saw recently with some federal policies that I hope are changed, in fact, I know they're going to be changed, if people don't care about it and they're not going to vote for it, protection of land is a legal construct that can be taken away. And so voters need to care about this issue.
Yep, I would second all of that. Getting people onto the land is important because it should be a human right, as you said, access to fresh air, clean water. I know I find a lot of peace and joy from being outdoors, and that's something that I would love everyone to have access to. And yeah, no one's going to fight against climate change to protect a planet if they don't care about it, if they don't care about other people getting the experiences that they've had, if they haven't necessarily experienced the beauty that there is in the world. And also, like you said, ensuring your customer base for the future. There are only going to be more people of color coming to the outdoors. Do you want them to buy from your company or not? Because they're going to be buying from somewhere. So again, with the program, it's probably a good decision. But I did remember what I wanted to share about paying folks. So if you're going to hire a more diverse staff, that's wonderful. Speaking from someone who's brought into an organization with the intention of diversifying the workforce, it can often fall on us to push the company forward, to lead the employee resource groups, to be on the diversity and equity committees. That is all work that should be paid as well. There are people whose entire job it is to do work like that. So expecting folks to do that on top of their other role at your company should be compensated. So I just wanted to add that to our last topic.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Laura. And I completely agree with that. Like, in my current position, for instance, I'm basically volunteering to lead this team that's improving diversity in our hiring efforts. And in the sense that that's great, right? And there's a lot of folks on the team who are also attorneys who work on all sorts of things for volunteering, and there's a sense that, hey, yeah, like a lot of people who are just working here care about it, and it's not just like this one person who's in charge of doing all the DEI work and everybody else can just kind of go business as usual. But there's definitely the other side of that as well, where I and kind of my colleagues we have a lot of other work to do. So it's very hard for us to really dedicate time to thinking about these issues and to figuring out solutions for them. And they're tough issues, right? Maybe as tough as any of the legal problems that we work with kind of on a daily basis. And they do require like expertise and just really time to think about and work on.
Yeah, they're very tough and they're also very personal. So bringing something so personal to you to work it's taxing.
Yeah. I'll also add that I definitely resonated with everything you guys said about why is this important, why does this matter. I'll also add a few things. One is that there is a lot of research in psychology and public health about how having an interaction with nature supports your physical, mental, and emotional health. And some of that research looks at if you've had a long day at work and you feel like your attention and willpower are drained, if you go and take a walk out in the woods, in a natural area, that can rejuvenate your kind of attention and cognitive abilities in a way that walking down the street in a busy city that does not have that same kind of effect. There's also interesting research about hospitals showing that if you're a patient there, kind of for an inpatient, and you're in a room that's kind of dark and not very interesting with lots of boring walls, that's not quite as good for your health outcomes as if you have a view of a natural space, or even like a painting or a photograph of a natural space. Just being able to look at that has measurable impacts on people's health outcomes. So I think of access to the outdoors as it's definitely a human right, as Lisa said, but it also has, maybe as part of being a human right, like real measurable impacts on people's physical and mental health, and in a sense, it's a public health issue.
If I could clap 1,000 times for that, I think what we're seeing during COVID in particular is it is the only thing people can do for their mental health, to get outside. It's low cost. You just strap on whatever tennis shoes you've got and you can be walking if you've got a safe place to go and you feel welcome. But it's one of the few things you can do. And there's not enough money from healthcare, whether it's healthcare companies or when we think about federal dollars that go for healthcare. It's a lot of times people just think about it as a physical health benefit, but I think you've pointed out something really important. It's a very significant mental health benefit. So when I think of a human right, I think of that as a human right, and we need to be investing more and not depending on the small budgets that come from the federal government for these natural resource agencies and the small budgets that typically exist for parks and trails, and really think about, corporate dollars are going into this, but is there a way healthcare dollars could go to contribute to this, to create an outdoors for all?
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything you said. I'll also add to a point that both of you made earlier about access to the outdoors as a way of getting people to care about the outdoors and the environment, and getting them to want to protect it. Both as a matter of how we're voting, but also as a matter of just what are your personal life habits in terms of resource and energy conservation. When I think of this, I think about the history of the environmental movement in the United States, and how in the 60s and the 70s, when environmentalism was becoming more of a thing, that a lot of folks at the forefront of that were white, and many of them were from middle and upper class backgrounds, and that that, along with other things, has kind of resulted in environmental protection as a partisan and even polarizing issue, when in fact it shouldn't be, right? In the sense that, of course, we can debate about, well, how much money do we put on environmental protection versus other things? That's always legitimate, but just the very concept of environmental protection, I think, is something that everybody should be behind, because we're all breathing the air, we all drink the water, we all live on the land. We're all kind of have received benefits from being in nature. And that's also something when I think about the kind of more recent movements surrounding climate change, I feel more heartened by that. There's much more diverse representation than there was 50 or 60 years ago. And I think, yeah, just to kind of recap on that access to the outdoors for all people is a kind of significant building block of making that happen. Okay, well, let's move on to the next question. And this actually dovetails one of the questions that one of our audience members asked. I'd like to ask both of you on, so we talked about, policy, we've talked about what different companies, organizations are doing. What about the role of average individuals, just as people who are living in America? What can we do as individuals to make a difference on this issue? And a sub question, which is from the Q&A, is how in particular can non-people of color individuals advocate for and be allies to underrepresented communities without inappropriately speaking for them or taking away leadership opportunities from them? Laura, do you want to start with that?
Sure, that's a great question, and one I get often. There are so many answers. I would advise, if you see people of color from other marginalized identities, when you're out doing your outdoor activity, just, do a friendly little wave, make people feel welcome in that way. Sometimes people take it a little too far and get to the point where they're like overly excited about seeing someone and want to make sure you really know how excited they are you're here, which can feel a little off-putting. Or maybe like the assumption that you're new to what you're doing, and so they want to be helpful by making you feel welcome by offering advice where maybe you don't need it. So make sure that when you are reaching out to people that you're doing it in a way that is actually going to make people feel comfortable doing your sport or activity or whatever you're doing. Share opportunities that you hear of. If you have friends from marginalized identities, make sure that you're passing on to them, inviting them to come outdoors with you to help break that stigma that only certain groups get outdoors. Those are a few of the things that are coming to mind. Support organizations like Outdoor Afro, Melanin Base Camp. There are a lot of people doing similar things to Brown Girls Climb in other sports, or just in the outdoors in general. So look for organizations like that you can support. If you're in the position to hire someone, make sure that you're pulling from a diverse candidate pool. Yeah, a lot of the things that we've talked about, if you have a way to lower a barrier for someone, take it upon yourself to do that.
That's a great list. All of the above, everything Laura just said. The other thing I'd say is use your voice at the local, state, and federal level with your policymakers about making sure you have green space, not just in your neighborhood, but in all neighborhoods. Advocate at the state level for funding to go towards creating an outdoors for all, and certainly use your voice at the federal level with your congressmen and senators when bills come up like Outdoors for All. And there, I don't know if Brown Girls Climb does this, but Outdoor Afro and some of the other groups also, you can follow their policy pages, and they will make it easy for you to identify what are the policies that are going to most benefit these organizations and these populations.
Thanks, Lisa. Laura, that was a pretty big list of solutions for people to think about in your daily lives. So please do. So we'll turn now from the individual action to more social action. Lisa, at the towards the beginning of our talk, you listed a number of federal and state and local policies in this area, and I wanted us to spend some time talking more about these, and maybe you could share, which policies do you feel like are most effective and needed, and are there policies that should be enacted that you think would be really helpful?
Do you want me to start?
Mm-hmm, sure.
Okay. Boy, there's so many, but some really good examples I'd give that are happening at both the state and federal level and are really a companion are in New Mexico, the legislature created Outdoor Equity Fund. They've not gotten the kind of money from the legislature that would really advance that, and so corporate donations have come in, but if there's a way to get more money at the state level. And then Senator Heinrich from New Mexico is championing the creation of a similar federal fund for outdoor equity, which would be, as I understand it, have a board that would really represent the groups they're trying to serve and ensure that there's some money going directly to these grassroots organizations that are working within communities to get both children and adults, families, outdoors for repeat and reinforcing experiences. That's just one example. I think we tend to think of these sweeping state and federal policies that we can pass, but it's also the everyday actions of the employees within the parks departments, state parks departments, and the National Park Service, and really making that a priority that people are, they take this seriously and are also break down that barrier, because that can be something that can be not welcoming. And so that's an internal policy thing, but it also needs to be paid attention to.
And Laura, do you have any thoughts you want to add on this?
Sure. Brown Girls Climb doesn't do a ton of policy work ourselves, but we have been doing some work to get folks connected with resources so that they can get more involved in the policy side of things. We host an event every year called Pancakes and Public Lands, or Pancakes and Policy, where we bring in experts on environmental policy and policy that's going to affect the outdoors and open it up to our community so they can come in, ask questions, and get more informed that way.
Thank you.
I guess I should have also added the thing we're really excited about how it's going to roll out. The president issued an executive order on January 27th around 30 by 30 for nature, and it very explicitly calls for the inclusion of equity groups and tribal and indigenous interests. And we see that as a real opportunity, whether at the federal or state level, to really start thinking about how we protect land, how it's used, and how we can really create land that both provides for biodiversity protection, outdoor access, but also can be used to help solve climate solutions, natural climate solutions to reduce greenhouse gases by either improving forestry practices. This is the devil's always in the details, but it's something we're really excited about. It would go across all federal agencies. We know we have several governors that are excited, and it's the first time to my knowledge, that the engagement of equity and tribal interests has been centered in a national policy like this.
I believe you're right, yeah.
Thank you both. Yeah, we have great expectations for what will come out of that. Okay, well, I think this is a good time to turn to the audience Q&A. I think we have about 10 questions so far, and for those of you in the audience, if you have a question you're thinking about asking, please submit that. So I think we'll be able to get to a lot of these today. So the first question says, a lot of the discussion so far has focused on, this person called it a higher level of outdoors activity like backpacking, camping, climbing, as well as the employment of professionals in outdoors industries. What about more basic opportunities for those who aren't interested in kind of doing these more strenuous things, such as visiting a Cannonball National Park or other parks focused on historical events? Is this part of the discussion, and how, if at all, are the diversity issues different for these kinds of less strenuous outdoors activities?
I think this is definitely part of the discussion. It's something that I like talking about, is reframing the narrative about what is considered outdoorsy. So is going to your local city park for a picnic or just, throw the baseball around, is that outdoorsy? I would say yes. But sometimes it's not. I mean, it's not what you're going to see on the cover of, an outdoor magazine. So as we were talking about earlier, where we were talking about shifting the representation, would love to also change the representation on what sports or outdoor activities are represented in the outdoors. And something else I think is really important to note is the safety that comes in when you're considering going outdoors. As someone from, the Black community, experiencing racism is something I have to consider when I go outdoors. If you think about the spate of people calling the police on Black folks in their park, just a guy who was out birding, the family who was having a barbecue, they had the police called on them. If you can't safely go and experience these less intense outdoor activities, then what is going to encourage you to go out further away from home into an area you're less familiar with? So I think it is really important that we bring these conversations to more local, less intense outdoor activities.
Yeah, this has been a real recent shift for the outdoor industry. I think people tend to think of Alex Honnold climbing the wall, and that's an intimidating image to a family thinking about their child going outside for the first time. And so, we're really rethinking and focusing on close to home outdoor recreation, and that going to a park, going for a walk they are the outdoors as much as, rock climbing, and which, we want all of these activities to occur. And then also really thinking about gateways that you didn't start as a child. Well, most people didn't, there are some, but most people as children don't start out in an extreme outdoor activity. They start out on a walk with their family or a visit to a park. And so really thinking about the outdoors as this continuum of experiences, and it's okay if you never become an ice climber or a, downhill skier. It's okay, and that all of it is good. And I really think that's a shift. And I've thought about a lot during COVID why somebody doesn't come up with a marketing campaign for their shoe that half the screen shows them walking in their neighborhood and the other half shows them using that same shoe on a more remote trail. To me, that's how my life is. I am not in faraway nature every day. I don't know many people that do. I don't live somewhere where that's super easy access. It's pretty easy access. But when you think about this mental health issue or families with little time, it is that close to home experience that's usually the thing that happens most.
Yeah, I definitely resonated with what both of you said. And Laura, as you were talking, I was thinking about what you were saying kind of earlier about cultural perceptions and expectations about who belongs in the outdoors. And I think by, seeing these closer to home experiences as also part of the outdoors, that might be a way to kind of shift some of those perceptions that, it's not that, the outdoors is a space for somebody else where I don't feel included, because in fact, I'm already using those spaces, right? It might be like a local park where I'm doing a barbecue, or a local stream where I'm going fishing, as opposed to a national park, but this is kind of my inroad to accessing some of those other spaces as well. Another idea that came to mind as both of you were talking is there was a scholar, I think maybe in the 70s, he came up with this term called the extinction of experience. And he used this term to refer to that, as urbanization increases, as people had fewer and fewer experiences of wild nature, of these more kind of, you really go out into a national park or wilderness area, as people have fewer experiences of those things, that our kind of perception of the normal level of nature becomes like more and more urbanized. And there is, as a result, just a less sense of urgency in protecting wild spaces where there's very limited or no human development. So I would say that I think it's definitely great to have access to these more kind of local resources, but it's also, I think, important for people to have access to these more wild spaces where they can really be kind of more immersed in the natural environment without human development. And I think that's important from both kind of a personal experience perspective and from the perspective of having people believe that these areas are important to conserve. Okay. Wow, we just got a whole lot more questions. Let's go to this one. Are there efforts by your organizations or other groups that incorporate outdoor access and outdoor education more broadly into school curriculums?
And tackle a little bit of that. So the work of our outdoor foundation, we didn't have much money to start, so we had to pick a lane. And the lane that they picked was really to focus on kids because of this desire to give them the experience and the data that we knew that if you don't experience it as a child, you're less likely to experience it as an adult. And so they're organizing the work around Thrive Outside communities and really turning the money over to local communities to figure out what groups should be involved, what network do you create so that kids have experience in schools, kids have experiences through Boys and Girls Clubs, YMCAs, as well as outdoor focused nonprofits, whether that's Outdoor Outreach in San Diego or the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance in Atlanta. And so schools are a part of it. It's not a big focus necessarily for us, except for through these local efforts. There is a big national movement, though, to bring, and I used to work on this in Colorado, to create more natural play spaces near schools to help with the outdoor curriculum that's in schools, that for many children, the only outdoor time they ever have is on the school playground. And back in the 70s, some decision was made somewhere to make school playgrounds essentially asphalt islands. And there's a real movement to turn them back into more natural spaces so that when you want to teach an outdoor class, you have that urban garden or a more natural play space. And so that's part of what we're funding through Thrive, but there's a big national movement through something called the Children in Nature Network to focus on these schools, and the Trust for Public Land has a similar focus. And I don't know if you want to add anything, Laura.
Sure. Brown Girls Climb hasn't worked directly with any schools as of yet, though I would love to. I have a background working with students. I've worked as a summer camp counselor all through high school and college, so working in the outdoors with children is something I'm really passionate about. And I can tell you from experience that having a camp counselor, you know, a nature guide is basically the role that I was fulfilling, who looked like some of our participants from more marginalized backgrounds made the experience different for them. And I know it did for me as a child as well, you know, like going camping for the first time and being able to ask, like, what am I supposed to do with my hair? Somebody who doesn't look like me might not have been able to give me an answer. So, uh,
Laura, are you still with us?
Something seems to be
yeah, did you
happening
catch
for,
any of that?
We caught some of it. You were crackling up a little bit because I think the connection was bad. I think we're hearing you more clearly now.
Oh, okay, apologies. Yeah, I was just saying that Brown Girls Climb hasn't worked with schools, but I do think that these conversations are important to bring into the narratives that we're telling our students and children about.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, thank you both. Our next question asks something I think is very important. So we've talked a lot about, you know, access to the outdoors and how that may be different for people of different races, or for men versus women, or based on socioeconomic background. This question asks, what about people with disabilities and their ability to access outdoor spaces? What is the conversation about that, and what is, if anything, is being done to include these people?
so for us, when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, it includes not just racial diversity, but also gender preference, gender identification, and ability, differently abled. So it's part of our Thrive Outside communities. It's certainly something we're thinking about. I can't think of a specific policy at the federal level that we're focusing on right now, but certainly at the local level. And the example I would give from work I did at the state level, again, it has to do with school playgrounds. Many of them moved from asphalt to using pea gravel. And it was pointed out to us that for autistic children, often they would pick up the pea gravel and put it in their mouths, and this was a real safety hazard. And it was actually the kids at the school that were not autistic that brought up the fact that their peers were having this experience, and that also for wheelchairs, that's very difficult to get through. And so we really worked a lot on a campaign to change the school playgrounds from this pea gravel or materials that make it very difficult for differently abled people to experience just school playgrounds. I know this is a focus also in some state parks. Here in Colorado, I know we have a new state park that we created called Staunton, where the state put a lot of investment into a way for there to be a different, I'm not going to use the right words, a different kind of wheelchair access further into the park, because what tends to happen in state and national parks is you can only go that first half mile or that first paved experience. And so how do you find ways so that people have different ways to access more backcountry experiences?
I'd just like to throw out a few resources for folks who are wanting to learn more on this. Can you all hear me? It looks like my screen is frozen.
Yes, Laura, we can hear you.
Okay, good deal. So Vasu Sujitra is a skiing athlete for the North Face. He's an adaptive skier and does a lot of work around creating access and disability awareness in the outdoors. And then Karima Botts is another great advocate. She runs a climbing program for climbers with disabilities and does a lot around creating access as well. So I just recommend checking out their work and the organizations that they're part of.
Thank you both for those ideas and resources. So our next question also kind of centers another marginalized group, which is Native people. And the question asks if we can speak more to the use of outdoors by Native people and the potential for Native groups to be a bridge for non-Native people of color to feel welcome in outdoor spaces.
Did you want to start first, Laura? I can't.
Yeah, yeah, I can start first. I think it's very important to include Native people in these conversations, and not only include them, but I believe that they should be the ones leading the conversations around what takes place on Native land. We're all on Native land here in the United States. Every city, every town, every outdoor landscape is home to a Native people that have been systemically displaced and denied access. And I think part of our role in creating access to more marginalized people is to also know to step away and give control back where we can. If you haven't already, I would encourage folks to read more about the Land Back movement, which is about giving Native folks control over their land again. But as far as them being a bridge to the outdoors, personally, I've experienced that. I've always been welcomed by Indigenous people, but I think it's on those of us who are not native to this land to learn how we can move through the outdoors with respect to Indigenous sovereignty and with Indigenous protocol in mind, making sure that we're not going into sacred places where we aren't welcome, making sure that we're doing research ahead of time to make sure that we are, showing respect in the best way possible.
Yeah, and I completely agree. Again, I mentioned 30 by 30, and it's really centering that Indigenous peoples in that conversation. And I would be remiss if I didn't note we have a Secretary of Interior nominee for the first time who is from the Taos Pueblo. It would be incredibly historic to have someone leading the agency that doesn't just oversee federal lands, but also oversees the Bureau of Indian Affairs for the first time in the history of the United States. We are very supportive of Representative Holland becoming the Secretary of Interior for that reason.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks, Laura. All right, our next question from the audience is about something quite different. So this goes back to our conversation about folks who are leading DEI efforts in their organizations, or folks who are just working in environmental justice spaces. And the question asks, do you have any suggestions or best practices for negotiating compensation for leading work on environmental justice or diversity, equity, and inclusion? And the questioner also asks, is there a baseline for the number, which I think refers to the salary amount?
I would suggest research on people who hold those positions already. As I said, like diversity manager or like diversity officer, there are different titles. Corporate responsibility manager, that's my role at Brown Girls Climb, can sometimes oversee initiatives like that within an organization. I would do some research and find out how people are compensated for that role, and then what that would translate to the amount of time you are putting in at your organization. This is, like I said, a paid position at many organizations. This is something you can get a bachelor's, master's, doctorate degree in. There are several certifications that people get to qualify themselves to do this work. It is a professional skill. You don't have diversity, equity, and inclusion expertise just because you come from a marginalized identity. Sure, you have expertise in your experience, but that doesn't mean that you can lead the initiative for your entire organization simply because you come from that background. It is important to have the qualifications and the know-how to do what you're doing. And it is important to recognize those qualifications by compensating you for your work. So like I said, I would recommend getting some research on other salaries. You can look at things like Glassdoor if you want, LinkedIn, any other place that you would find a job posting, look at what the salary is and then translate that to the amount of time that you are putting in at your organization. That would be my advice.
Yeah, and there's an organization that's, I think, collecting some of this information. We're about to do a workplace survey across our organizations, but there's something called the In Solidarity Project, which was started by Teresa Baker, and it's got a matching program for employers and employees. And I know we have leaned on them in the past when we've looked for, we need to hire somebody who do you have a suite of people that you recommend? And so I think they're tracking some of this information.
Awesome. Thank you both. The more we talk, the more I realize, wow, like I don't know like half the stuff you guys are saying, and I'm definitely learning a lot. So I'm glad to be here listening to this panel. Okay, our next question is also about money, which of course is very important. Could you talk more about lines of outdoor gear that might be lower costs and more welcoming to folks who are from lower income backgrounds or who are just newer to outdoor recreation and want to spend less?
Well, I'm really pleased by the movement, both from a climate perspective and a cost perspective, that many in our industry are looking at reuse and retooling of gear, both from a sustainability perspective and a cost perspective. Rental gear, and then the whole nonprofit concept behind gear libraries, and how can you make those available in communities so that when somebody, through an organization like the YMCA or a local organization, if you're just trying climbing for the first time or you're just trying camping for the first time, you not only have access to gear at low or no cost, but you also get some resources to help teach you how to use them safely, which is really important. So this is a movement that I think is happening. And I also think many outdoor companies are looking at lower lines of gear because they do see that there's a huge potential for the entry level participant.
Yeah, I'd love to shout out Indigenous Women Hike. Jolie Varela has an amazing gear library for her community, and she even provides gift cards for gas and food when she can to families who are checking out gear. So she's setting a really great example if you're interested in learning what a gear library looks like in practice. Indigenous Women Hike is her platform. Yeah, any gear that you can find that's been used, refurbished. I know REI does a biannual garage sale. I think it's biannual, where you can get returned gear that's often brand new for lower cost. Most big box stores have gear. I would recommend reading the reviews because, I like to go with brands that specialize in outdoor gear, so I know that it's gonna last, but we have to make do where we can. But yeah, it's pretty easy to find used gear on sites like Craigslist and OfferUp. And yeah, I would recommend the REI garage sale as well, because again, you can get some brand new gear for a low cost.
Awesome. Well, lots of great brand and resource suggestions there. Our next question, well, I guess Laura, you can take this question. So it says, I'm so psyched to see somebody from the climbing community on this panel. Yay. And the question specifically asks, are places like Access Fund doing enough to ensure not only access to climbing areas, but that the access is equitable as well? So any of you who'd like to share about that?
That is a great question. I can speak to what Access Fund has done with Brown Girls Climb. They've partnered with us on several events. Our Color the Crag festival that we put on, they've supported that. They've hosted or co-hosted some of our virtual events with us during COVID. But I think like a lot of organizations, outdoor organizations, there's always more that can be done. So yeah, I think that's what I want to say on that.
Awesome.
They're in the headed in the right direction, but more that can be done.
And for folks who might not know, of which I'm one of them, what does the Access Fund do more broadly?
They create and maintain access to outdoor spaces.
Okay, awesome. All right. Oh, this is quite interesting. So our next question is, what do you think of programs that close down city streets for pedestrians to walk on as a bridge to getting people outdoors in different settings?
Well, the outdoor industry doesn't have an official policy on it. I've seen it in action in the city and county of Denver, and particularly during COVID, it was amazing. It was a way for people to socially distance, provided immediate access. I think it's a great thing for every city to look at as a way to provide their citizens access close to home.
Yeah, I'm 100% in favor.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree as well. You got to start somewhere with the outdoors, and if that's the easiest place to start, which it feels relatively easy, especially during COVID times, then start there. Okay, our next question is a little bit more conceptual and philosophical. How do we explain the word justice in the context of diversifying the outdoors? This reader says, justice can be a polarizing term and one that can also be thought of in a kind of law and order frame. What, in your view, is a more accurate understanding of justice in diversifying the outdoors?
For me, justice does not lie with the legal system. Thinking from the system's perspective that we were talking about earlier, the current justice system that's in place is not working in favor of anyone from a marginalized identity. For me, what justice in the outdoors would look like would be returning control of the land to its original inhabitants and letting those folks decide what justice, access, inclusion, diversity looks like. So I think the reason that it can be so polarizing is because when you actually break down justice as more of a philosophical thing outside of our justice system, it seems very extreme. It seems very extreme to some people to consider giving full and complete control back to a group of people who have been removed from their homeland. But I think if we take justice literally, that's what it looks like for me.
Yeah, I haven't thought of it that way, so that's very interesting. I guess I've thought about it as in a similar vein, in that you can be inclusive, which is more about welcoming and respecting and acknowledging people's lived histories. You can be equitable, which means providing the same. And what justice really gets at is the historical inequities, and how do you do more than just be equitable to make up for this long history of inequity?
Yeah, I'd also add that I think about justice, law and order is obviously a part of that, criminal justice is a part of that, but think about justice generally as just, you have a group of people or even just people and the environment. You have different beings kind of, being together in a community, and are people being treated fairly? Are people receiving equitable access to resources? And those resources, of course, include access to the outdoors and all the benefits that we mentioned earlier. I think for me, justice also encompasses the non-human members of our community as well. Are we taking the right efforts to kind of protect them and honor their right to be, to just exist, right? Yeah, so I think of justice in a very holistic way. All right, we're running up towards the end of our time here, but I think we have space for a couple more questions. So this next one, Lisa, maybe you can go first on this. So this person says they work for a small startup that helps beginner campers get into camping by renting gear, showing customers how to use and set up gear, and so on. And the question is a little bit more general. What are some best practices you would suggest or resources for implementing DEI in small startup businesses specifically?
Wow, so this isn't my area of expertise. There is something called the Outdoor Empowered Network, which works on gear libraries and DEI issues and really helps people starting this think about what are best practices and how to do this. I would really defer to them. They're a great resource. They're nonprofit, and that would be where I would go first. I know some of our companies like REI have contributed to gear libraries, and so they might have some thoughts on this, but I really think this Outdoors Empowered Network, there are probably some gear library community organizations that are not part of that network, and I don't know if the one that Laura mentioned is, but there's so many of these community gear libraries which really focus on, as I mentioned, both providing the gear, but also training in the gear, which is really important. And just speaking with others that have walked before you to give you their experience on how to do this, I think is the best approach.
Awesome. And Laura?
Yeah, I was just going to add the suggestion to build relationships with people in your local community. So the people that you're looking to reach with your organization, build relationships with them and see what is needed, because that's always better than having to guess.
Absolutely. Awesome. Okay, our next question is also a very practical one. So we talked a lot about recruiting diverse candidates for jobs in the outdoors industry, and the questioner asks, where do you suggest posting these job postings so you can reach a wider and more diverse audience?
Well, I have to give another shout out to the In Solidarity project. They keep this job board. There are lots of job boards, but that one seems to be the most national and the most focused on this issue. There's also something, oh, I hope I don't get the name wrong, and I hope you can remember it, Laura. It's Base Camp Outdoors. Am I calling it the right?
Base Camp?
No, it's an online only kind of job connector. I wouldn't call it a job board, but you can. I see it on Facebook and in Clubhouse, but I haven't used it. We've used the In Solidarity project.
Last time I was looking for a job in the outdoor industry, I think Camber had a job board. And then Brown Girls Climb, we also have a newsletter that we send out monthly with outdoor industry jobs. So those are two other resources I'd suggest.
Awesome. And I'll add my 2 cents. So places that we kind of post to or have thought about posting to, include just kind of all the, I guess, environmental job boards that we can think of, and there's a lot of bar associations in the legal area that have those these kind of mailing lists that you can post to. In addition, when we're recruiting attorneys, we email all of the law schools, and sometimes we also focus on particular faculty members or minority student associations at those law schools who have particular connections with these more diverse communities. At the national level, there are also minority bar associations like the National Bar Association for African Americans, there's a National Asian Pacific Bar Association, National Hispanic Bar Association, and so on. So that's a very legal industry specific answer, but I imagine for a lot of postings, you might also have these kind of affinity groups in your area. All right, well, I think that wraps it up for us today. Lisa and Laura, thank you so much. I learned a huge amount from both of you, and I'm wowed at both kind of your knowledge and just how much stuff there is going on on this hard issue. And with that, I'll turn it back to Chandler.
Well, thank you so much, Ryland, and thank you so much to our audience for joining us today and your many thought-provoking questions. We hope you'll continue to watch this space in the years ahead. And an enormous thank you to our outstanding panelists, Lisa, Laura, and Ryland. We just so appreciate your many contributions to today's program. Thank you all so much again. Please take care and stay safe. Thank you all.